Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started with our GO Committee work session. I do want to start by expressing my condolences to Representative Cummings' family. This is a really tough day for us here in Maryland and in the nation. He will definitely be somebody that would be missed, somebody that I admired greatly. So we need to keep family, friends, and I think the nation in our prayers. Today, we are going to discuss one particular item, which is very important, and it's our fiscal plan. And this really is a continuation of the committee's July 11th review of the county's economic indicators of fiscal policies. And I know that we do have 4 recommendations that have been prepared by council staff, and we'll decide today which ones we'd like to implement, or if we want to implement all of them. I know that a lot of work has been put into this, so I want to thank you, Mr. Gene Smith, for putting this together and for really tracking a lot of the areas that we need to focus on when it comes to our fiscal discipline here in the county. I also want to thank you, Mr. Platt, for being here. Also, Mr. Mullen for being here as well. And so let's get right into the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Smith to walk us through, and then we'll pause if we need to in order to ask questions or engage in a dialogue. Mr. Smith.
Certainly, thank you. As the chair stated, this is a continuation from our July 11th conversation. We may have more depending on the committee's desire. Certainly the recommendations include a follow-up as staff has presented some options to do some minor updates to the fiscal plan summary, but those updates would be done in collaboration with the executive staff, with council staff, and even with the agencies as we go forth, if that's the committee's desire, and then bring them back and present them. So today's discussion is going to focus just on the fiscal plan. There's other policies, obviously, in the county's or the council's fiscal policy resolution, and we may get to those. The fiscal plan summary is on Circle 5. We approve this each June, or I should say the council approves this each June. The council also then receives an update in December, which primarily looks at the revenue changes that we see. And then there's a final revision in the March recommended budget. So that's the 3 times the council really sees this document. The document's pretty important. It provides a high-level summary of our fiscal health, kind of where things are at over the next 6 years, including the current year. There are 3 main blocks of information that council staff points out. There's the revenue section, which are projected and estimated by our staff over an executive side. And these form the base for all of the resources in the fiscal plan. There's the non-operating budget uses, which highlights a lot of the fiscal policies that the council has set out, such as reserves and OPEB. And then finally, there's the agency uses, which is the primary operating budgets for all the 4 agencies that the council appropriates money for. The council's fiscal policy resolution requires that this 6-year fiscal plan is balanced, meaning that the resources available in the plan, that the expenditures in the plan do not exceed the resources available, and the council has always approved a balanced fiscal plan. Council staff also wants to note that the fiscal plan is always a snapshot in time. Numbers will change. Certainly in years 5 and 6, we don't have a crystal ball, and so each time we look at this document, the numbers do change, and I think that's some of the reasons why having some minor updates will help us understand how those fluctuations occur so we're not caught off guard. So I'll just go ahead and jump into the recommendations that we have. So as we can see on Circle 5, a couple of the taxes are highlighted, property tax, income tax in particular. But as you can see on Circle 6, the changes in kind of what the council approves and what we actually receive fluctuates a lot more in the income tax. And that's primarily because more than 30% of our income tax is non-wage income tax. And non-wage income tax includes capital gains, dividends, interest, S corporations, and those are not dependent on like a recurring earned income. It depends on when individuals choose to take those gains, which is why that fluctuates a lot. We've always known that. We talk about that a lot, but simply assuming that into the total income tax makes it feel like our income tax sometimes is falling through the floor, when in reality it's just part of the fluctuations in the non-wage income tax. And so the first recommendation that staff has is that we should begin to separate non-wage income tax from wage income tax, which is more stable, so that we can begin to track that particular part of our revenue source, which again is much larger compared to other Maryland jurisdictions. Most of them are averaging in the 17-18% in non-wage. The county is averaging in 30% a year in terms of reported income. And by tracking that, I think it gives the council a clear indication of, again, a highly volatile area, and so we have a better understanding of what's going on there, rather than, again, having it rolled up into the income tax. So I will stop there and let the committee discuss.
Mr. Platt, what do you think about this? I know that there are a number of observations regarding how complex doing these analyses, and also Montgomery County, I think in particular, has a lot of different fiscal realities that make it very unique. And so, as Mr. Smith said, the fiscal plan is a snapshot in time, and we're always trying to refine it to be able to get as close as we can to predict everything. So, what do you think about this particular recommendation?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councilmember Katz. It has been a challenge, and especially as Mr. Smith referred to, the non-wage sources of 30%, and that is a pretty sizable portion of the non-wage income. And when we look at the amount of taxes that are paid by the millionaires and so forth, represent maybe about 2-3%. I have to go back and validate the data. About 2-3% of the tax returns are in that category. They provide maybe 20% of the tax revenues. So we're talking about a very small sector of the taxpayers that have the most volatility, and that's where we see the big swing. If I may digress for one moment, our big challenge has always been the November reconciliation distribution. That's when all the tax returns are in for the prior calendar year, or tax year, excuse me, and that's those who file for an extension. Most likely they're at the high end of the income scale. Going back and look at the data that we look for the statistics of income, the relationship between the capital gains and our November reconciliation, 60% of the deviation in that November reconciliation deviation can be explained by the deviation in the capital gains. So that really tells you the challenges, again, of what even us, the state, is faced with that challenge on the capital gains. So that's something that we keep monitoring. We try to do the best we can, looking at sources outside the state, who is forecasting capital gains, and there's very little information at the government level, which is where we rely most of our information. Is the official. Saying CBO does, Congressional Budget Office does their forecast of capital gains in February. We draw down on that, look at that relationship, and then go forward on that. The other issue is I call the dividends, interest, and rents. That's another little bit of volatility. It's not as much as the capital gains, but that still has a role to play in the non-wage income. So those things are the challenges when we have that kind of a percentages, and it swings from year to year. That brings us an effort. And what Mr. Smith has proposed in terms of looking at these, the background of this information in more detail, I think is something that we can work with council staff on this, to draw down on the historical data. We're only at 2016 on the statistics of income, and that was before the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is we're waiting for data on 2017, even from the IRS on the SOI data, because usually in August, they usually will have that data. We haven't seen that yet. That will give us an indication of the capital gains, the non-wage income that Mr. Smith referred to see what the kind of a swing there was in those types of data. Also, they provide information on the pass-through, which is another issue that we're trying to track, is how many corporations are going from the pass-through to a C corporation. Now, we've been told by the state in meeting the Bureau of Revenue Estimates that their contacts think there might not be a significant shift. And the reason for that, now that's just in conversation they have with the tax attorneys, because the expectations, the corporate tax may be changed, and so people don't want to lock themselves in to a C corporation and can't go back. They can't go back and forth, so they may not be encouraged or the incentive to do that kind of a switch. But anyways, we still try to monitor that based on that kind of data. So given the issue of separating out the sources of income, I think is good a value for everybody, I would think.
Wonderful.
And if I may, The issue for us, we work with the State Bureau of Revenue Estimates, and they provide us their non-withholding income, which is slightly different than what Mr. Smith, I don't want to, kind of data. They use that to look at their withholding and the non-withholding income, which is really estimated payments, fiduciary, and final payments as the three categories. Estimated payments have been very volatile. And the reason I bring this up, if I may mention this, is that when we get our distribution, it's based on what comes in at the state level. And if the state level is showing a real significant drop in estimated payments, which is what happened in February, there was a 32% drop in estimated payments from the fourth quarter, from the previous fourth quarter. That has a pretty significant impact on our February distribution. That's the kind of information that we can share and discuss with the council staff, because we have the state level data to show that volatility and those factors, the final payments, the fiduciary, and estimated payments. We don't have it at our level. That's the other downside to some of our analysis. But I think the approach that Mr. Smith, Gene Smith, is, if I may.
He's not going to Washington. Mr. Smith.
I'm sorry. I've known him for many years, and I feel thing. But that's something that we can work with in sharing the information and how should coordinating with on that.
Excellent. All right. So I think that I'm hearing a lot of support here on the committee as well to go ahead and work on recommendation number 1, to display non-wage income tax revenue. Great.
Great. And I was remiss to say that we haven't done a lot of changes to the fiscal plan summary, so that's partly the reason why we're doing this in committee. I mean, we could easily exchange, and I've been working with Mr. Platt and Mr. Mullen quite a bit on this, but nonetheless, rather than showing up with a new document in June, it felt good for the council to be able to see what those options were and be able to weigh into that. And then obviously we can work on, as Mr. Platt said, I mean, the complexity is there. Staff can handle that and make sure that's displayed and communicated correctly, but we don't have to get into the minutia of how all of that works, as long as we're displaying information accurately. And so the public kind of understands where the risk is associated also with our revenues. So moving on to the second one, which is a good segue. The fiscal plan summary has estimates for all of the tax revenues, but as we can see on Circle 5, they do fluctuate. We know that. We all realize that, but I think having the opportunity to understand kind of what the range or the threshold is for those based on historical averages, one, communicates clearly that we expect those numbers may change, and that's not a scare. Life happens. But two, more importantly, that if we have an expected range, if the December update comes in and lo and behold we're short, say, $40 million, but the range is expected maybe we could be anywhere between plus or minus $100 million, it's not like the sky is falling. That's well within what we were expecting. And so what council staff is recommending then on the fiscal plan summary, we estimate and work with executive staff to estimate some ranges based on revenue resources, partly because, again, that will also see where volatility exists the most. Going back to the non-wage income, we would expect that to have the most possibility of swinging, where property tax will be tighter. And then, two, we can also see how that changes over time so that we can refine our estimates. And council staff will say that the fiscal plan summary is not a binding document, so the estimates there will still be, the estimates for revenue for each fiscal year that the council will approve will be still provided by finance in the budget. There'll be specific numbers that will be based on what we can then spend money on. But the fiscal plan summary, having an opportunity to see ranges again, will be an opportunity just to display information more accurately.
Yes, Mr. Platt, anything?
If I may add one other element, I think I brought this up at the July meeting. We depend a lot on the state and also federal agencies for a lot of the economic indicators that are driving some of our, especially on the income tax, wage and salaries, employment, and so forth, strictly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis. And I believe that in July, I mentioned the fact that they do revisions to that data. And that's what can create another bit of uncertainty, not a bit of uncertainty, it will create an uncertainty because they now go back and revise those numbers that we base our forecast on. And what the Bureau of Labor Statistics did on the resident employment was pretty significant revisions for the last 5 years. The same with the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They'll go back maybe a year or two and revise it, but sometimes they'll go back further. So I'm getting into technical aspects of this, but I just want to bring this up to say the risks are not just other areas of taxpayer behavior, but it's also the sources of data that we get from the federal and state departments when they do a revision. The Bureau of Revenue Estimates is very helpful for us. They provide us their state forecast. They did one in September when the Board of Revenue Estimates meet, and we drill down from their forecasts. Of course, if they change their forecast in December slightly, that again, that will impact us. I'm probably getting into the weeds a little bit here, Madam Chair, Mr. Katz, and Mr. Friedson, but that's giving you a background of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, no, it's all very important because, and I think, and we can talk about this after we finish our recommendations, but I think part of it also is how we frame all of this. I think in some ways we should take a step back to see how we present this fiscal plan so it's somewhat, more accessible to our residents in terms of understanding. But this is very important information that we also need to include as, in terms of what are the caveats to go into this fiscal plan, because there's no doubt that then we are left explaining a lot of things because the expectations are set out in the community, and the more information that we are able to share ahead of time, right, I think it just helps all of us be more transparent, but also, a lot more targeted in what it is that we're dealing with in terms of the available funds and how we then allocate that when it comes to, hearing from our community what the needs are. So I think that this is a really important exercise to rethink not only what information we're adding, but then how we might make it a bit more user-friendly. So it's not just, charts with lines and everything. I think we can work on that as well. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I absolutely agree with that point and look forward to that broader conversation. Just had a quick specific question about this recommendation. Is the idea that we're going to have a set range, presumably based on like a standard deviation where it's, instead of, we pick the number and then there's a set range, or is it the how far the band goes or how far the range is will be discretionary each time? I'm just trying to understand how a range would work or what we're talking about.
Sure, I'll start since I'm recommending it. My thought would be that the estimates are already provided based on finances data, and then using historical ranges based on when actual revenues have come in, what has been that band. So let's say property taxes has fluctuated anywhere between plus or minus 2%, given our estimate. That would be the range that is shown as a plus or minus 2% deviation could happen here. Or we can then calculate that as well into actual value, dollar values, if that's more useful to the public or to the council. But the idea is, again, to not be focused on the specific number in the fiscal plan because we know that's going to change, but to understand the kind of threshold of where that number may fluctuate. And each different revenue source will fluctuate differently based on our historical volatility. But I don't. That's my impression. Again, if the committee set us forth, we would work with our executive staff, and they may have a different approach, and we would interplay that and then provide a recommendation that met the committee's expectation before you to see how it would look.
That works for me, and I think it's a really important recommendation. I think it will help provide context to this. But my only request, I suppose, related to the recommendation is that we have a set approach to how the range is developed. So whether we look at the 10-year rolling average of what the fluctuation is, or whether we have a standard deviation of a finite amount of, plus or minus 2% as was standard, whatever the case may be, and that is noted, and then that is part of the policy as well. So it's not just that we're going to have a range that we pick each year, because to me, if we have a range and the range is picked every year of how we develop the range, then we are back in the same place we are now, which is we're throwing a dart at the dartboard and hoping we're close to right. And, based on lots of data and lots of hard work by really smart people. But what this should do is smooth out that process, and by making it formalized and making it, to the point made by the council president previously, transparent of here's exactly, here's the number, and here's the range, and here's how we determine that range, so it doesn't just seem like we've made up numbers out of thin air based on algorithms and data analysis that's very iterative but that nobody understands. So thank you.
I think, if I may, I think you're going to create the methodology and stick with a particular methodology. That's, if I'm.
Consistency in the methodology.
The methodology, and you're absolutely right, Councilmember Friedson, that you can play that methodology from year to year, but if you establish and accept that methodology, and it's proved by the historical analysis that that does work, then you're pretty well set from, and it could be the standard deviation, it could be some other method, but whatever method you go back and look at, here's how reliable that methodology is, that would be perfect. I mean, that's my opinion.
Awesome. Okay, so we are set for number 2 as well.
Excellent. So that I am finished with the revenue section of the fiscal plan, and so actually, my apologies. No, I'm not. So as you can see on Circle 5, the assumptions on the number 4 says state aid, including MCPS and Montgomery College, is not projected to increase from fiscal 20 to 25. We've talked about this before. It seems unlikely that the state aid will be held steady for those 6 years in the fiscal plan. Staff is simply recommending that, again, we'll work with executive staff to develop a rubric and, much to Mr. Friedson's point, make it very transparent how that's done. That includes that because it constrains the fiscal plan, especially in the out years, by assuming 0% growth. We don't do that for any other revenues, and so I'm simply saying for all intergovernmental aid, anything that's not that we hold constant, we need to come up with a good reason to do that, or we just need to grow those projections into the fiscal plan.
I agree. Okay, I think we agree with that.
And then the final recommendation in terms of updating the fiscal plan, it doesn't even require any new lines. Lines 24, 25, 26, and 27 on Circle 5 are the agency uses based on the approved budget in fiscal 19, and this is for Circle 5 specifically, and then also the approved budget that the council just did in June of fiscal 20. However, the future fiscal years 21 through 25, it's just an aggregate for total agency use, and council staff will just say that's kind of pointless since we already have an expectation that MOE has calculations for both the college and MCPS. The county government's budget book includes future fiscal impacts for all 6 years. Those numbers are available. We will need to work with park and planning because they don't have the similar formulaic approach, say, as MCPS or college or the county government. But detailing that information, council staff believes is highly relevant to understanding kind of the fiscal health of our expenditure and agency use. And so that's the recommendation, is that we should come up again with formulaic approaches that we can all agree upon, and then not only just council and executive staff, but I would include MCPS, the college, park and planning, and the actual agencies beyond that, so that one, we understand what that is being communicated in there, how that was calculated, and two, again, I'll just reiterate that these are not expectations for how the council will approve budget in future fiscal years. This is a financial tool, and so each year the council will approach a recommended budget on March 15th like they always do, and will allocate resources based on what they believe is the best way to do that. But again, I believe for the public and the council to see a 6-year plan that's complete is important.
Okay, what do my colleagues think?
Yep.
We would like to do that.
Very good.
Thank you.
And then the last item that I included in the memo, purely because I remember Mr. Katz asked for it, I had no recommendations for it, was just related to the pay-go policy, which is set at 10%. And so on page 4 and 5 of the memo, there's some background on that. I think the takeaway is that the county's policy has been in existence for a long time, whether written or unwritten. It became more formalized in the middle aughts, 2006-07 period. And a lot of jurisdictions have a pay-go policy, but there's no right or wrong way to do that. I think the most important thing is that the county sets a policy, sticks with a policy. Again, that's what the rating agencies will look at. And then I provide some information about how, if we change the pay-go threshold based on our policy, what that would mean in terms of current revenue on the second table. But ultimately, I believe the 10%, council staff believes 10% is good. It's the minimum, and then the council can always, if they believe the additional revenue is needed for the capital budget, allocate more to pay-go if they wish, or not choose to do that. But the 10% threshold, I do not believe needs to be reevaluated right now.
Yes, Member Katz.
Thank you very much. The information was most useful, and I appreciated it. I needed the background, and you certainly have provided it, so thank you very much.
Great. Anything else?
That is all I have. I recall you mentioned you may have additional, you had mentioned we might have a further conversation, whether that's future or not, but council staff has nothing more to present today.
No, I mean, I think that this really is aligned with, the work that the committee's promised would do, to begin to take, a very detailed look at our different fiscal policies, as well as the way that we even can enhance the fiscal plan. It's a great tool, and the more that we can refine it, I think the better off we're going to be. Exactly, as I said earlier, because we do need to be able to explain, very clearly, not only to our, with ourselves here on the council when we have to deliberate, but also to the public. So, perhaps the next step will be, how do we frame it so it becomes a lot more user-friendly and a lot more understandable and relatable. That would be, I think, the next step. But I think these are really good, improvements. Yeah. All right. Well, with that, I think that's all we have. So we're adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thanks.